the panel, which is by Izzy Levy. So Izzy Levy is a first-year candidate for a PhD in classics at Columbia University. The research interests primarily lie in exploring how frameworks of gender and sexuality operate within Greek and Roman literature, and how contemporary receptions engage with classical material to grapple with questions of gender and sexuality today. Their MA thesis examined questions of bodies in performance raised by Euripides Helen through the lens of drag and by receptions of Helen in drag, including their own. They can also be found living out of a drag king fantasies on the New York stage as Izzy OK. And their paper is titled Wiping Away the Paint, Drag, Euripides, Helen, and Epistemologies of the Body in Performance. And I'm gonna leave it over to them now.
Hi, thank you, Lena and Nia, so much for those amazing presentations. I'm gonna move away from fan fiction, but your presentations both have me in mind of a comment that a friend of mine made once about fan fiction, or rather drag in particularly cosplay settings as live action AMV, animated music video, which I think hopefully you will see a little live action AMV in some of the performance that I'm going to be talking about today. So this presentation centers on Wiping Away the Paint, which is a drag reception of Euripides Helen that I created and performed as part of a larger thesis exploring drag and the Helen. Their shared preoccupations with the problems posed by bodies in performance and the theatrical techniques common to both. These include the heightening and hybridizing of oppositional binaries. So for example, male and female, copy and original, surface and substance, costume and body, through the theatricality and meta-theatricality of mimetic performance in order to question the naturalized reality, and I'll do some heavy air quotes there, reality of such oppositions. I'll elaborate on that thesis today, and I'm happy to say more in Q&A, but I also offer my performance as a methodological provocation. As a member of the local drag community myself, I felt pulled to take a more participatory approach. So I'll discuss Wiping Away the Paint both as a reception dramatizing the claims of my thesis and as a key part of my process. Reception as not just an object of scholarly study, but an opportunity to explore unorthodox interpretive idioms. So I want to start with a brief discussion of my theoretical framework for drag. In particular, I pose a definition that moves away from drag as necessarily involving cross-gender presentation. And actually, before I go any further, I just want to drop a handout that I have with a couple of definitions. Now, I am wondering about sharing files. I think I sent it in a quick email ahead of time, but I can also see if I can. Well, for now,
I could grab it if you send it to the Oxford Queer email.
Okay, I think I sent it along yesterday, but I can also continue, and everyone can reference afterward with some of the quotes that are on there. So anyway, to back up with drag, I pose a definition that moves away from drag as necessarily involving cross-gender presentation. So the idea that drag is a person performing in the opposite gender. So this formulation only reifies binary notions of gender and the idea that certain traits more naturally belong to certain genders. Many performers have moved away from this model, but it's proved pervasive in academic treatments. My definition of drag owes much to Ash Blight, a fellow New York City performer who you will see tomorrow evening perform, who describes drag as performance that comments on or plays with gender using heightened expression. With this in mind, I define drag as a mode of performance that cites gendered codes with some degree of heightened difference or theatricality. By theatricality, I mean features of performance that draw heightened attention via excess, exaggeration, and breaches of proper comportment. Meta-theatricality in a tragic context is theatricality in this sense. This hyperbolic or even parodic theatricality is key to the subversive potential that Judith Butler has famously ascribed to drag. In 1990's Gender Trouble, she argues that, quote, in imitating gender, drag implicitly reveals the imitative structure of gender itself, an imitation of a so-called naturalized original that does not actually exist, strictly performative in the sense that its existence is constituted by its repeated enactment and not any originary truth. In later works, Butler attributes drag's oppositional possibilities to hyperbole or theatricality. Drag exposes the limits of hegemonic gender codes by citing them with a heightened difference, thus countering the understated, taken for granted quality of heterosexual performativity. Also instructive on this front is the queer phenomenological approach taken by Sarah Ahmed in her 2006 article, Orientations Toward a Queer Phenomenology. She writes that the norms governing the tendencies of bodies, what we take for granted that bodies do, are not actually inherent, but, quote, happen in the very repetition of gestures. The labor of such repetition disappears through labor. If we work hard at something, then it seems effortless. The more familiar the gestures of a body become, the more its tendencies appear natural to its imagined essence. This phenomenological approach complements Butler's conception of performativity when we think about drag. If a naturalized gendered effect is produced by the repetition of familiar gendered actions, drag produces non-normative queer gendered effects by performing unfamiliar gendered actions or familiar actions rendered strange by their theatricality, their exaggeration, or the mismatch with their context. Drag defamiliarizes gender. In Ahmed's words, it serves as a disorientation device. For drag to reveal gender as performative is for it to call attention to the labor of gender's repetition and the contingency of its construction of reality. So drag's theatrical attention to the construction of reality is what I think makes it such an interesting partner prism for thinking about Euripides Helen. I see a few key points of contact. The first is hybridity, a both and approach, which mutually implicates binary terms premised as opposites and thus complicates them. Drag most obviously takes a hybridized approach to gender. For Helen, these hybridized terms could include mortal and divine. She's sort of a mortal woman, also the daughter of a god, or maybe not. The logos is unclear, as Euripides has her say in the Helen. Other hybridized terms for Helen could be agent or object. The premise of Euripides' tragedy sets out a central opposition between the blameless protagonist Helen, who did not go to Troy but has been in Egypt the whole time, and her more problematic eidolon double, an opposition which hardly remains stable throughout the play. Both drag and the Helen take a hybridizing approach to the dualities of appearance and reality, exterior and interior, substance and essence, costume and body. Because of her hybridity, Helen tends to create epistemological epistemological difficulties, especially around attempts to pin down her real essence. Euripides takes Helen's ambiguity as one of his central problems, and it is largely through her that he poses his challenge to the nature of reality itself, particularly what reality means in the context of mimetic theater. The Helen utilizes techniques similar to those of a drag performer, theatricality, in this case meta-theatricality, to lay bare the role of generic norms by playfully exaggerating them. An especially striking example is Helen's deception of the Egyptian king Theoclymenus, self-consciously figured in Euripides as a play within a play, a meta-theatrical game of costumes and dramatic irony, which I would read as roughly analogous to a drag performance. It's in these scenes that Euripides most dramatically disorients the binary terms of his central opposition between Helen and Eidolon. Although the premise initially differentiates the rehabilitated protagonist from her Eidolon, who is a stand-in for the more problematic Helen of tradition, the figures are confused throughout, as Pietro Pucci, Michelle Jansen, Brian Lush, and many others have noted. Helen and the Eidolon use similar speech patterns. Their problematic bodies are described in similar language of crafted visual art and costume. Both pose compelling claims to the status of the real Helen. In the scenes with Theoclymenus, the protagonist Helen dramatically assimilates herself with the Eidolon, employing just the same deception and seduction that the phantom double is accused of using. Her performance operates on two levels. For Theoclymenus, Helen is performing mourning tragic wife realness, crafting herself as an illusion of all that is desirable in a bride. But the scene is also full of double entendre, meta-theatrical references, particularly to costuming, and exaggerated citation of gendered tragic norms. Helen nods throughout to the artificiality of her performance on narrative and meta-theatrical levels. Ultimately, Euripides stages the confluence of two Helens in one body, the blameless protagonist and the destructive, seductive Eidolon, creating a disorienting effect not dissimilar to that of drag. Reading the Helen with drag in mind, we might conclude that the real Helen is so hard to find because she isn't real at all. Like the imitative ideals of gender that drag challenges, Helen is shown to be functionally all mimesis. Strictly speaking, this is true for all characters appearing in drama because they are characters appearing in a drama of mimesis. But the insistent meta-theatricality with which Euripides treats his protagonist reminds us of Helen's exemplary relationship to mimesis throughout the tradition. For example, the Helen of Odyssey 4, who is able to mimic the voices of the Greek soldiers' wives. Froma Zeitlin has argued that Helen and storytelling might be the same thing. Helen is the figure who links eros and poetics together under the role of the rubric of mimesis. So as a way of framing my performance, I want to focus on a particular meta-theatrical gesture early in Euripides Helen. The protagonist laments her beauty. She says, "Would that I, having been wiped away like an agoma, a painted surface, could take back up again an uglier appearance instead of a beautiful one." This is a nod to the similarities with the eidolon, a beautiful crafted image, but it is also, as Ruby Blondell notes, a meta-theatrical gesture that draws attention to the painted surface of the actor's mask. It may even hint at an eventual change of masks when Helen adopts her costume of mourning later in the play. Helen's pointed equivalence here of body and costume really piqued my interest from a drag perspective. And so the image of wiping away the paint became a focal point for the performance, wiping away the paint. And with that, I'm going to show a few clips. Just going to share my screen. Pull this up. Hopefully you can see beyond just my desktop, but I will full screen this. Paris came to Sparta to take me as his wife, but Hera, angry that she hadn't defeated the goddesses, blew my marriage to Paris all away and gave him not me, but a breathing image made to look like me, constructed from the stuff of the sky. Paris thinks he has me, an illusion. I was set up as a prize for the strength of the Trojans, a contest of the spear for the Greeks. No, not me, my name. Hermes took me up into the folds of the air, shrouding me in a cloud. But many souls perished by the river's Scamander because of me. A monstrous marvel is my life. Marvelously monstrous are these things. Maybe because of Hera, or maybe my beauty is to blame. I wish I could be wiped away, like so much paint, and take again an uglier appearance instead of a beautiful one. But if I gave up on being pretty, I wouldn't know how to be alive. I should move to a brand new city and teach myself how to die. Honey, what you take, honey, look at me, tell me what you do, what you take. Honey, what you take, honey, look at me, tell me what you do, what you take. Honey, what you take, honey, look at me, tell me what you took, what you say. Honey, what you take, honey, look at me, tell me what you took, what you say. It's always weird for me to watch that I can't I have a hard time identifying that as myself. Sorry, I will actually what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to copy and paste the Greek of that wiping away the paint line, just in case anyone is curious to take a look at it, right into the chat. So this performance was one of the earliest steps in my project of bringing drag and Helen into conversation. I wanted to turn to performance for two reasons. First, as an idiom with interpretive possibilities different from those of orthodox academic writing, and second, to foreground my personal investments in drag as a performance practice and a community in which I participate, not simply as an object of distant scholarly study. First, I'm going to talk about wiping away the paint as a microcosm of my thesis before turning to the second point for some concluding thoughts. So first, a note on tone. Is drag tragedy something of an oxymoron? The hyperbolic parody and irreverence of drag is often paired with comedy, and it might seem absurd next to the kind of grave pathos that we tend to associate with Athenian tragedy, although that's somewhat of another reductive binary assumption, given that Euripides Helen itself is prone to hyperbole, irreverence, and comedy. Additionally, the deconstructive powers of drag need not only operate on a playful or comic register. A performer's theatrical pain can convey the arbitrary limitations of hegemonic gendered systems in much the same way, emphasizing their cruelty alongside their absurdity. Wiping away the paint aims at just that. To return to Sarah Ahmed, the piece disorients its audience in relation to an understanding of gender as painless, a natural state which unproblematically constitutes what one is. I both perform the process of hypergendered costuming. It was important to me that I be in the process of putting on the drag in the video. So both the process of putting on the costuming and then struggling to scratch it away, reinforcing the physical and emotional effort and even pain that goes into maintaining a coherently gendered body. Disorientation via pathos is one way that I tried to unsettle stable notions of the real in this performance. Another concern that I borrow from the Helen is the confusion of who is the real Helen and who is the imitation or the eidolon. I actually bring the eidolon on stage through disorienting play with mirrors. The doubling effect of the eidolon, narratively and linguistically evoked in Euripides, is here visually realized. Even the performer seems confused by its distorting consequences. At one moment that I didn't show in the clip, I slide my hand first down my own face and then against the surface of the mirror, as if testing the similarity of the images. It's tempting to cast me, the flesh and blood performer, as the original Helen and the reflection as the imitative eidolon, but the reflection starts to exert a similar supplementary pressure as its Euripidean sibling through its visual dominance. The facial movements and expressions crucial to the lip sync are exclusively visible on the surface of the mirror, giving the eidolon reflection her own claim to the role of protagonist. Here is the Helen whom Froma Zeitlin reads as mimesis embodied, and who shows, quote, that the imagistic signifies just as profoundly as what is conceived of as the substance, to quote Nancy Warman. Another central question, both in the Helen and in this performance, is how to evaluate Helen's beauty. The distress of performer and reflection, as well as the prologue text at the opening, firmly establish the destructive capacities of this beauty. The real issue, as often with Helen, is one of culpability. The performer Helen lip syncs directly and confrontationally at her reflection, as if pinning the blame on the mirror eidolon. Of course, this dynamic cannot stably hold for long, just as it doesn't in Euripides. Mirrors are doubling, but they are also reflexive, and the accusations and victimized posturing of the performer Helen are thrown back at her by the mirror Helen. Neither has complete control of the narrative because both performer and reflection actually lip sync the same words. Another complication to the question of beauty and blame arises when Helen tries to wipe away the paint. Here's where I put to the test the hypothetical fantasy of Euripides' protagonist, who wishes her beauty could be wiped away like paint or removed like a mask. What would it mean for Helen to take off the mask of her beauty? First, it would suggest Helen's awareness of the negative effects of her beauty. In wiping away the paint, I introduce this line as I am in the process of applying makeup, implicating my drag Helen in the construction of her own appearance. But as much as this initially implies Helen's agency in making herself eidolon, the performance's final moments cast serious doubt on her actual level of control. Set to the lyrics, and thank you, Mitski, for these lyrics. If I gave up on being pretty, I wouldn't know how to be alive. I should move to a brand new city and teach myself how to die. Reaching for a cloth to wipe away the paint seems nearly suicidal. Ruby Blondell argues that the connection of Helen as a figure to her legendary beauty is so crucial that her hypothetical in Euripides is essentially wishing for annihilation. When my Helen tries to wipe the makeup from her face, it won't come off. This moment is theatrical in its failure. We are reminded that we are dealing with makeup, which is costume, but the costume doesn't work the way we think it should. Its relationship with the performer's body is no longer that of illusionistic ornamentation applied to a realer foundation. The problem becomes not so much Helen's ethical relationship to her beauty or her control over it, but the degree to which there is even something real underneath the surface to which she can return. From this perspective, the impossibility of Helen's wish is in its hope for return to some sort of original state of naked truth. Euripides' Greek at lines 262, 263, which is where that line is taken from, emphasizes this wish with its overdetermined use of the phrase autis palin, back again, there as if there is a real Helen to go back again to. But again, for both Euripides' Helen and wiping away the paint, there is no real Helen to be found. This performance confronts its Helen directly with that realization. Despite the wiping and the tearing, the performer's makeup will not come off to show us who the real Helen is, what the bare material looks like under all that paint. Any search for the real when it comes to these Helens will meet only with futility. This is the most valuable, in my eyes, or at least for my process, confluence of Helen and drag. Any drag-informed framework for reading is also necessarily a Helen-informed one, reminding us that surface, style, or appearance can signify with just as much impact as substance, authenticity, or reality. It reminds us too that when it comes to performance and performativity, reality may not be so stable or natural as we take for granted. So to conclude real quick, I want to return to the reasons that I set out for turning to performance. To reiterate, the first is that performance is an idiom with interpretive possibilities beyond those of orthodox academic writing. In particular, reception and performance shines a light on the interpreting body. The body's gestures and its affects are foregrounded as vehicles for reading, processing, and transforming ancient drama and communicating the results of one's inquiry. This was a valuable shift for my focus on bodies and performance, particularly encountering a more conventional bias toward textual modes of reading tragedy. More broadly, however, performed reception makes much needed room for affective engagement with ancient drama, something hardly absent from Orthodox scholarly writing, but emphatically obscured as a standard rule. We as academics are rarely invited to view our emotional responses to ancient material as a source of legitimate insight, unless we're thinking, oh wow, the majesty of Virgil's use of chiasmus, or something like that. Here's where the second reason comes in. As a drag performer and participant in local drag communities, I felt it was important to center my personal investments in drag, rather than treating it as an object of distant scholarly study. Again, my project does not involve a unique degree of personal involvement. As classicists, we all maintain personal investment in what we study. That's why we study it. But we are expected to adopt a stance of remote analysis premised on gendered and racialized notions of objectivity. I hope that both my performance and this presentation have offered a test case in the kind of conclusions that can be reached or provocations that can be made when we as scholars, and in my case as a queer scholar, resist the expectation to absent ourselves from our work. Thank you.